Um, Very good evening to all of you. We are live now. So we are here in the eighth episode of the lecture series, What is Marxism? Introductory lectures. Today's topic is Capitalism Part 3 and State. So, Pranabda, if you are ready, you can start.
Uh, Good evening, everybody. So let us straight away move into uh, lecture. Yes, I hope you can see the slide. Okay. So just a quick recapitulation and summarizing what we intend to talk about today. We followed Marx's sequence of arguments to build the structure of capitalist fundamental class process, starting from CC exchange, that is commodity against commodity, barter, and simple commodity production. Then we moved on to, yes, visible? Is it visible? Visible? Okay. Uh, we followed the development from CC circuit, that is commodity against commodity, to mediation, commodity exchange with mediation of money, CMC. And from there, this overlaps with the other circuit, that is MCM, because if people are exchanging through the medium of money, then unlike commodities, which in this structure before capitalism comes, commodities vanish from the circuit, they are purchased and consumed. So they vanish from the circuit, but money continues to exist within the circuit. So there will be some people who will be starting with money and ending with money. Money is held on by somebody or the other. So we have the MCM, and this specialized group of people who hold on to money. We had argued that, of course, they are not exchanging in order to get something different, but quantitatively more. So they end with MCM prime, M prime being greater than M. And from there, we moved on to the capitalist fundamental class process. M with a certain amount of money, M inputs are purchased, including labor power, and this transformed into a set of output, C prime, which is more than C in value because it includes surplus value. And then this is sold in the market for M prime, which is more than M, the difference being what we call profit. Then we had seen also that abstract labor, which determines price, is a concept that emerges as a result of real abstraction in society caused by primitive accumulation. We interpreted, we discussed what we mean by real abstraction as opposed to ideal abstraction. Now, we've also seen that primitive accumulation breeds commodity fetishism, and we elaborated what is meant by commodity fetishism. We had discussed one moment of overdetermination in the genesis and structure of capitalism, that is primitive accumulation. We had seen that primitive accumulation gives birth to alienated labor, and because the labor power that is being sold by the worker is something alien to me. It's something which, in fact, is seen as opposing the laborer, as contributing to the power of the capitalist. So this is alienated labor which is done without the planning of the laborer. The planning is done by the capitalist or his agent. And so the laborer, having sold his labor power, his or her labor power, is no longer interested in what is done with it. So it has to be forced. So the master servant relationship inside the factory. And we had seen the relation of this with commodity fetishism, and we had also seen that primitive accumulation is embedded in the very structure of capitalism. It is not something primitive in the sense that it precedes capital alone, but we had discussed this through some examples, that it is something which continues as capitalism grows, primitive accumulation. It is embedded in the very structure of capitalism. It has to continue in order for capitalism to thrive. Today, we discussed two other moments of overdetermination. First, in the variability of V, that is variable capital, and secondly, in the origins and nature of capitalist crisis, as discussed by Marx. Of course, it is not that Marx discussed capitalist crisis in a very thorough way, or that his theory is something which contributes some very much to our understanding, today's understanding of capitalist crisis, but is very important historically, and also because through the discussion of capitalist crisis, Marx, as Marx did it, we can see that economics is overdetermined by politics, culture, etc., etc. We will then go on to discuss in the second part of this lecture the rudimentary elements of the theory of the state in Marxism. In this segment, we will discuss the instrumentalist view of the state, the relative autonomy view of the state, and the question of the ideological state apparatus. Now, to proceed first to the moments of overdetermination. First, variable capital. Now, just for a quick recap, we had seen this slide that the capitalist starts with M1, purchases a basket of commodities which we call CM1, whose value is C plus V. This is the capital. M1 is the capital, which is money capital converted into commodity capital, whose value is C plus V. C is the embodied labor. This is C contains raw materials, intermediate goods, and also the depreciation of machinery. And V, with V, what is purchased living labor, live labor. That is the labor power. With V, we purchase labor power, and this labor power, its value is V. It replenishes its own value V, and it also produces a surplus value. So this live labor passes on its value just as embodied labor passes on its value. Now, why is this called constant capital embodied labor? Because it just passes on. Yarn will just pass on its own value. Whatever is the value of the yarn that is used in production, it will pass on its own value, that predetermined value, to the cloth. On the other hand, the investment in variable capital, V, this doesn't pass on a predetermined value. Why? Because with V is purchased the paid part of live labor. V is purchased live labor, the labor power that is working in the factory. This produces first its own reproduction V, and it also produces a surplus value. So it is variable. It's called variable because, first of all, it will depend on the political, cultural climate, how much labor power can be purchased with a given V. Then that will determine what is the surplus value. So this is called variable capital because it does the value that this investment passes on, that is the labor power that is purchased with V, that is not predetermined. Unlike this, what is passed on here is predetermined. Now, to come back, C is constant in the sense that constant capital passes on its predetermined value to output, as we just now talked about. Yarn passes on its own value. V is variable in the sense that the amount of value added to output by the use of this capital, that is the value of labor power, V plus S, is variable or uncertain. There are two reasons for this. One is that V, the value of the wage basket that is deemed necessary to live and work for a day. We had taken the example of, suppose the work day is 10 hours. And the value of the wage basket is variable. It could be 6 hours, that, as in our example, which we took in our last, discussed in our last meeting. 6 hours is the value of the wage basket. It could be six, it could be five, it could be four. On what will it depend? It would depend on the degree of unionization. Also, the life of family has to be ensured. This becomes an important question, at least at the beginning of the capitalist fundamental historical beginning. The question of women and children working. When women and children start working, women and children were paid less. The logic was that, well, you don't have to reproduce the family labor, family that is being done by the male, so they are paid less. So V is variable, wage basket is variable, degree of unionization, life of the family has to be assured. Social norms regarding necessary substance depends on political climate. You see, when unionization is not very strong, when the politics is very conservative, at that point of time, the employer can push through lower wages. So it will depend on the political climate. Secondly, we what a fixed, what a given week can purchase, the labor power that can purchase will also depend on the hours of work. This is also variable because lengthening of workday is possible, and this causes increase in what Marx calls absolute surplus value. So with 6 hours, say value 6, you are buying 10 hours. Now if it can be increased to 11 hours, so then surplus value increases from 4 to 5. There is also the possibility of intensification of work. This is the relative surplus value. This, of course, will occur in the leading firms, and then this will even out. We are not going to the details of that. Now, both of these cause increase in S surplus value for a given V, and that is why we say that V is variable capital. Hence, the economic process is overdetermined by political and cultural processes, and vice versa. So this is another moment of overdetermination. What we are discussing is that capitalism, neither in its birth or in its structure, is purely an economic phenomena, unlike what the mainstream economists would claim. Now, uh, the most significant area where Marx discusses this where we find this manifestation of overdetermination is the area of capitalist crisis. To understand Marx's view on capitalist crisis, we have to understand first price formation under capitalist commodity production. Now, we had said that prices are proportional to values, and we had argued this in the context of simple commodity production. Now, when it comes to capitalist commodity production, prices are not proportional to values. And in fact, this is one of the points on which Marx lauded Adam Smith, because Adam Smith was the first to say that no, prices cannot be proportional to values in a capitalist system, though he did not understand why this is so. Now, to understand that, we elaborate two ratios proposed by Marx. One is C by V. That is, C is the constant capital, V is the variable capital. This ratio Marx calls the organic composition of capital. Then S by V, that is surplus value divided by the value of labor power itself, variable capital. This is, Marx calls this the rate of exploitation, which is also called the rate of surplus value. This represents the ratio of hours worked for capitalists. C is the number of, this is the surplus value, so this is the number of hours, the 4. This is the number of hours worked for the capitalist, and V, this is 6. This is the number of hours worked for self. So this is a ratio of hours worked for capitalists to the hours worked for self. So this is given the very vivid name of rate of exploitation. Now, in abstract labor value terms, the surplus is S and the total capital is C plus V. So the rate of surplus value will be this divided by this. That is the surplus divided by capital invested. So S divided by C plus V. So just a little bit of algebra. We are dividing both the numerator, what is on top, that is S, and what is at the bottom, denominator, by both by the same magnitude V. So we have S by V on top, and in the denominator we have 1 plus C by V. Now, uh, S by V, as we have said, this is, so we have rate of exploitation on top, and 1 plus the organic composition of capital and below in the denominator. So this gives us the rate of profit in value terms. Now, you can see clearly that if C by V increases, if S by V is constant, then the rate of profit will fall. Now, Marx assumed that the rate of exploitation in a country being determined by macro processes are the same across the country and is the same across sectors, and it also remains more or less same for a long period of time. So if C by V increases over time, then given S by V is constant, we'll have the rate of profit in value terms will fall in. But before that, just as a digression, this is the rate of profit in value terms. So one can see that if C by V is greater than average in any line of production, if the organic composition is greater than average, now because it occurs in the denominator, if it is greater, then the rate of profit in abstract labor terms will be less than average. And the opposite will be true in lines of production where the organic composition is less than the average. So, but capital allocation is in equilibrium if and only if rates of profit at equilibrium prices is equal, rates of profit are equal. So now we see that if C by V is different in the different lines of production, then where it is greater, the rate of profit in value terms will be less, and where it is lesser, the rate of profit in value terms will be smaller. So one has to compensate this. How is it compensated? That price will be greater than abstract labor value, where C by V is greater, organic composition is greater than average. Therefore, the rate of profit is less than average. So then price of that commodity is increased to compensate. And where the opposite, where the organic composition is lower than average and where the rate of profit in value terms is more than average, then prices in those sectors in equilibrium must be lowered than abstract labor value, so that the rate of profit is equaled out. Now, this is of course a digression. What is important is the role of C by V is important for long run crisis. As we can see from here, if C by V increases, then the rate of profit will decrease. Now, Marx says in volume 3 of Capital, the same rate of surplus value would express itself under the same degree of labor exploitation in a falling rate of profit, because the material growth of the constant capital implies also a growth, albeit not in the same proportion, in its value. So what Marx is saying is that in a capitalist production process, because of surplus value, so surplus value, how is it used? Surplus value will be used to expand production, because the surplus value is the value over and above the value that is derived in the market to replenish C and V. So C and V are already they are taken care of. Surplus value is over and above that. Now, what would the capitalist do with that? Obviously, part of that the capitalist would consume, but a large part of that the capitalist would invest to increase. So delta C and delta V, they would increase C and V. So Marx is saying that when the material growth, there will be a constant material growth of the constant capital, but this implies also a growth, albeit not in the same proportion, in its value. What is he assuming? He therefore assumes that growth in the C sector causes growth in organic composition. Why? Because he says that this would express itself under the same degree of exploitation in a falling rate of profit, because the material growth of constant capital implies also a growth, albeit not in the same proportion, in its value. So C is growing, but it's not growing in the same, its value is not going at the same rate. Why? because there's increase in C by V. Therefore, V is not increasing in the same proportion as C. Therefore, value is not increasing in the same proportion as increase in C. So C is growing, but C by V is increasing. So V is not growing in the same proportion, and therefore the value, there's a growth in value, but albeit not in the same proportion. So that means that with growth, C by V is growing. It is further assumed, this is not only in the capital C sector, it is further assumed that this gradual change in the composition of capital is not confined only to individual spheres of production, but that it occurs more or less in all, or at least in the key spheres of production, so that it involves changes in the average organic composition of the total capital of a certain society. Then the gradual growth of constant capital in relation to variable capital must necessarily lead to a gradual fall of the general rate of profit. So as C by V rises, the general rate of profit will decline. So long as the rate of surplus value or the intensity of exploitation of labor remains the same, the S by V remains the same. So as C by V grows, the rate of profit will decrease. So obviously, this would be a source of crisis within the capitalist sector. But Marx also talks of crisis of underconsumption. Rising C by V causes decline in rate of growth of demand for labor, because production is becoming more and more mechanized, is becoming more and more capital intensive. Increasing surplus value causes decrease in demand for labor. Now, intensification, there are, Marx also mentions various factors which can offset the falling rate of profit. One could be the intensification of labor caused by increase in pace of work because of introduction of modern machinery. Another could be depression of wages below the value of labor power. Though he does not elaborate this, presumably this would be the result of competition among laborers who became increasingly unemployed. This leads to decrease in socially accepted conception of subsistence, and thus fee declines. So decrease of wages below the value of labor power. Below the value of labor power means, of course, the socially recognized value of labor power will be paid to them. But what is happening is that the socially recognized value of labor power is declining, and so it is declining in relation to what it was before. So V decline would also offset the fall in the rate of profit. Cheapening of the elements of constant capital was also mentioned, as the rate of profit in general tended to fall and technological improvements caused increase in productivity. The value and price of components of constant capital would also fall. You see, if productivity rises, so with the same amount of labor, more is being produced, and that implies that the same value is producing more commodities. So per unit of commodity, the value will fall. Cheapening of the, so this causes cheapening of the elements of constant capital. So that will again cause an increase in the rate of profit. Marx claims that relative overpopulation could also act as a countervailing force. The argument runs like this: as organic composition and so capital intensity of production increased, a lot of the workforce would lose their jobs. This relative overpopulation would allow small enterprises with low organic composition paying low wages to become viable. This would reduce the overall composition of capital and so increase the rate of profit. You see, all sectors do not have the same organic composition of capital. The larger enterprises with which are more mechanized, they would have a higher organic composition. Now, when the rate of profit is falling, as the organic composition is increasing, less labor is being required for incremental output. So this causes relative overpopulation. Now, when it causes relative overpopulation, the wage falls, as Marx had previously argued. Now, who will gain most? Those who are employing more labor per unit will gain the most when the wages of labor decline. So this would be the small enterprises. And these small enterprises are typically those which have lower organic composition. So The smaller enterprises would become more viable. Some of the large enterprises would shut down, and in this process, what would happen is that the average organic combustion would again would decline. So this would be a countervailing force. Countervailing factors, however, contribute also to underconsumption prices because this causes a lowering of wages, overpopulation. All these cause the purchasing power of the laboring masses to go down. And so this could contribute to a crisis of underconsumption. Now, we'll skip these last 2 points because we are not elaborating them. Uh, the discussion of capitalist crisis. Now, Marx has a very organized discussion of capitalist crisis. These what we are discussing so far are organized discussion of I'm sorry for the. Can you hear me? Sorry for the interruption. My Wi-Fi has somehow gone out. I'm using the hotspot. I hope that we can before. So, how far did we go? Can you see the slide? Acha, acha. So, what I was saying is that uh, mm, the elements of crisis that I've talked about so far, these were scattered elements over Capital Volume 1, Volume 3, and in Grundrisse. There is a structured discussion in Chapter 17 of the Theory of Surplus Value, which we shall now discuss. This starts the method Marx uses to discuss crisis in this Chapter 17 of the Theories of Surplus Value is by critiquing the Say's law, which was accepted by all classical political economists like Smith or Ricardo. Now, what this Say's law says was that is that there cannot be on the aggregate any excess demand or excess supply. Now, what was the basis of this argument? The basis of this argument was simply this circuit, CC circuit. You see, whenever there's a barter exchange, what happens when the weaver is coming to the market to buy, weaver and the carpenter are meeting, the weaver is demanding tables, and at the same time, the value of the tables that the weaver is demanding is the same, is equivalent to the value of cloth that the weaver is supplying. So every exchange, each agent comes to the market with equivalent supply and demand, equal value of supply and demand. So there cannot be any, that it is possible that the weaver cannot find someone to buy cloth and sell tables. And as we said, it could go on and on. There could be individual markets, there could be oversupply, over demand, but there could not be overall uh, oversupply or over demand, excess supply or excess demand, because each buyer would come to the market with the same value of supply as the value that he or she demanded. Now, what Marx, through this chain, discusses that the contradictions, we will elaborate this, the contradictions inherent in the circulation of commodities, which are further developed in the circulation of money, and thus also the possibilities of crisis reproduce themselves automatically in capital, since developed circulation of commodities and of money, in fact, only takes place on the basis of capital. Now, let us elaborate this code. Contradictions inherent in the circulation of commodities. Now, what does Marx mean by this? What he means is, of course, that non-existence of reciprocity of demand and supply. This could lead to partial, not general imbalance. So reciprocity, there is no, the weaver cannot find someone to sell tables, goes and exchanges that with wheat and then with corn, etc., etc. So there could be partial disturbance, but no general imbalance. This is further developed in the circulation of commodities. What does this mean? That with the circulation of money, because we once money is introduced, a time, there can be a time lag when money is used as store of value. So money is extracted, money, someone sells, I sell a cloth, get money. I don't buy tables immediately. So I wait. So during that time, purchasing power is withdrawn from circuit. So this itself could heighten the crisis. Now, further, when we consider the circuit MCM prime, the trader has come in. Here, as we had discussed, no value is created through the activity of trade, but the trader is making a profit, M prime minus N. How is the trader making this profit? By either selling things below their value, above their value, or buying things below their value, or doing both. So this happens. So the producer and the buyer, they are being shortchanged. They're not getting their value. So then this will probably, for the producer, when the producer gets less value, this will lead to a situation where you will cut back in production. So heightens potential crisis, demand supply mismatch. Mercantile profit is earned buying below and selling above or both. Producers fail to obtain value, there's a realization problem, so there could be a disruption of supply. So this is what Marx means by further developed in the circulation of commodities. In fact, only takes place, all this only takes place on the basis of capital. That is what he's saying. Now, what does Marx mean by this? In the circulation, the crisis develops in the circulation and reproduction phase, not in its production, because in the production, this is totally within the factory, it is within the control of the capitalist. It is only when it's going to the exchange, circulation, that and reproduction of capital, when you are selling, getting money to replenish the stock and to expand. So, but though it is taking place in circulation and production phase of capital, it is present in the production process itself in surplus value, which is the reason for production. So, why is the capitalist investing in production? In order to earn surplus value, in order to expand M into M prime, not through like the merchant buying short or selling dear. It's not so, by expanding value in production to earn surplus value. That is the object of production. Now, it is present in the production process itself in surplus value, which is the reason for production. If there, again, this is a quotation from the surplus value, volumes on surplus value, page 711. If the relation of demand and supply is taken in a wider and more concrete sense, then it comprises the relation of production or reproduction and consumption or circulation as well. Here again, the unity of these two phases, which does not exist and which forcibly asserts itself during the crisis, must be seen as opposed to the segregation and antagonism between these two phases. So production and consumption. So in production, the capitalist is trying to extract as much surplus value as possible. And in consumption, you try to realize, you have realized surplus value, you try to convert it into money. So there is a crisis, there is a antagonism between this. You're trying to maximize surplus value, reduce the consumption power, and then you're trying to sell and replenish your stock, whereas you've already reduced your consumption power. So here again, the unity of these two phases, which does exist and which forcibly asserts itself during the crisis, unless there is a unity of these two phases, capital will not get reproduced. So it manifests itself in crisis, must be seen as opposed in separation and antagonism of these two phases. Separation and antagonism, which exist as such and are moreover typical of bourgeois production. Thus, for expansion in any sector, a balanced expansion in all sectors is necessary to allow the sale of products at cost price, which is structurally impossible. So the motivation is to earn more and more surplus value. This is coming into conflict, antagonism with the motivation of realization through consumption. And then this is manifesting itself in crisis, because there's no you cannot realize the surplus value that you have extracted. For this to be possible, all the sectors had to expand together at the same rate, purchasing power to increase similarly, but that is not structurally possible within the capitalist system, because the only motivation for any capitalist enterprise is to maximize the rate of surplus value. The reasons offered for capitalist crisis: general overproduction is caused by the very nature of capitalist production. Capitalist production, the purpose is production of surplus value. This surplus value will be used to increase. Delta is increase constant capital, increase variable capital. and this will cause increase in productivity also, and together with increase in organic composition. All these together, increase in productivity, increase in organic composition, this causes restriction of the total wages paid to a minimum. So purchasing power increases at slower rate than output of necessity. So this is a general crisis of general overproduction. Now there could be accidental equalization. It is the only way. Accidental equalization is the only way in which balance is achieved. Though production is more interdependent in capitalist mode because of specialization and large scale production, you see, when scale of production was smaller, specialization was not carried out to that large extent. Now, because of this specialization, now in fact, you would have large enterprises which are only weaving, large industries which are only spinning, large industries which are only polishing cloth, for example. Now, all these then become interdependent, and so they have to rely on one another. The rates of expansion of each is dependent on the rates of expansion of the others. So, unless they expand in a balance, which is not possible, there can be only accidental equalization. M also had a clear understanding of the input-output balance. Now, this is another quotation on theories on surplus value. But when one considers the process as a whole, it is evident that the producers of means of subsistence cannot purchase any replacement machinery or replacement raw materials unless producers of the replacements of constant capital buy their means of subsistence from them. In other words, unless the circulation is fundamental in exchange between means of subsistence and constant capital. So, what is pointing to a particular kind of exchange where between the constant machine producers and the means of subsistence. He's saying that unless there is a balance, unless what the value of constant capital that the subsistence producers want to buy is equal to the value of subsistence basket which the constant capital producer needs to finance the purchase of variable capital. Unless the two balance, the need of variable subsistence for constant for machine making industries and the need of machines in the subsistence making industry, unless this balance, there will be a crisis. So here there's clearly an understanding of the input-output balance. Marx also had a rudimentary theory of the cyclical behavior of the capitalist economy. He says, again in Theories of Surplus Value, uh, since the circulation process of capital is not completed in one day, but extends over a fairly long period until capital returns to its original form. Now, what does it mean by capital returns to its original form? Now, this is just all those who know economics will be familiar with. This is cyclical behavior. So it starts from here, and it comes back to its original form. Uh, so this is what is saying, that since the circulation process of capital is not complete in one day, but takes a long period, all that time for extends over a fairly long period until capital returns to its original form. Since this period coincides with the period within which market prices equalize with cost prices. So through this cyclical up and down, through the up and down in the cyclical process, the market prices will sometimes be lower, sometimes be lower, sometimes be higher than the cost of production. But it is since this period coincides with the period in which market prices equalize with cost prices only at the end of the cycle, and great upheavals and changes takes place in the market in the course of this period. So he's obviously referring to the cyclical process where you have great upheavals, ups and downs. Changes takes place in the market in the course of this period. Since great changes takes place in the productivity of capital labor and therefore also in the real value of commodities, it is quite clear that between the starting point, the prerequisite capital, the when you start with stock of capital, and the time of its return at the end of these periods, Great catastrophes must have occurred and elements of crisis must have gathered and developed. And these cannot in any way be dismissed by the pitiful proposition that products exchange for products. So, saying that because of the production is capitalist production, so you're trying to realize surplus value, there will be cyclical movements and there will be great upheavals. And you cannot, the Say's law, which says that products exchange for products, this cannot be a valid way of understanding the capitalist economy. So there are two manifestations of this cyclical depression that Marx talks about. One, there can be a physical destruction of capital. So when the capitalist is being unable to replenish capital, is being unable to realize the value of the goods produced in the by selling in the market, one thing that could happen is the shutdown. So machines fall into disuse, labor is laid off, etc. There's a physical destruction of capital. Two, there can be a destruction of nominal value of capital and not use value. Output is monetized at prices that do not cover the cost of production. So there is bankruptcy and fixed capital is sold. So you're not being able to realize the value. So you're selling your assets. And this leads to what Lenin was to call later centralization and concentration of capital. So there could be two ways in which depression is manifested. Crisis is the forcible establishment of unity between elements that have become independent and the enforced separation between one another of elements which are essentially one. Elements is capitalist production, circulation, and reproduction. All these are elements of the capitalist production system. But these elements have been separated. There is C, C prime, there is N, C, there is C prime, N prime. These have been separated, but and because of this separation, there is a there is a constant crisis, uh, and this crisis establishes a unity when there is a destruction of capital. All these causes that Marx talks about resolve into social production and private appropriation by capital. Why social production? Because production has now become very large scale. It is also long-winded or mechanized. There is greater specialization, so interdependence between the various spheres of production. And private appropriation by capital. Not only private appropriation, which would happen in a CMC circuit also, but private appropriation by capital. So there is a lack of coordination. Capital is only interested in enterprise is only interested in its own surplus value. So there is no question of coordinating. There's no question of looking at the reciprocity of demand and supply. Objective of production is reproduction of capital with rate of profit at average rate. So there is a systemic push for continuous expansion. So you're earning profit, so you're reinvesting. So there is a systemic push for continuous expansion. In this sense, in fact, Marx praises capitalism as opposed to previous what he calls modes of production. Within the capitalist system, there's always a continuous push for expansion of production. So private appropriation of capital also leads to large dispersed markets, because large scale production is becoming larger and larger. So these markets are also, you have to sell your products in very various markets, and so this leads to greater sectoral imbalance. Production based on anticipation of demand. So you're producing the weaver is producing, anticipating expanding production, anticipating that the spinner is expanding production in the anticipation that the weaver will expand production. And we have seen also that previously we've seen that in the case of the capital goods sector, of course, it can produce only on the expectation that the other sectors are expanding. Even if it wants to keep its production at the same level, it is only if the other sectors are expanding, because unless other sectors expand, there will be no demand for new machinery. So there will be no production of the machine goods sector. So all production is based on anticipation of demand. The role of expectations in capitalist crisis is therefore highlighted in the private appropriation by capital. So all this leads to the reinforces the idea of overdetermination of economic and political because of the fundamental nature of capitalism, because of the class nature of surplus appropriation. Therefore, you have this scheme of expanded reproduction, and therefore, on the basis of anticipations. And so, this is the political class structure is determining the nature of the economic crisis. And there is continuing primitive accumulation and capitalist motive for primitive accumulation, trying to get out of the crisis, and you're leading to greater and greater crisis. So that brings us to the conclusion of this segment. So let us move on to the next part of our lecture, which uh, is on the nature of the state. So, if there are any questions on this segment, should I take? I think I'll take it now because I'll move on to something which is totally different from what we were discussing so far, which was mainly a question of economics. We move on to something which is more, though we talked of overdetermination of the political, because the capitalist fundamental class process itself is determined, is a political process. And so there is overdetermination, but we'll move on to discuss something which is in which economics comes in a secondary way, just like economics comes in a secondary way in the discussion of crisis. So if there are some any question, I'll take it here and then move on to the discussion of state. Or if there are none, then I'll directly move on. So I think I'll move on.
Oh, hello. Yes, actually, microphone was
Is
not
there a
on.
question?
Yes, yes,
Is
yes.
there?
What I was asking you about that when you talked about this profitability of the capitalist is actually depending on the surplus value and all these crises. I was thinking about that. What about that crisis
Pardon me,
among
could
the?
you come slowly? I'm not getting. Yes, could you please repeat yourself?
Uh, I was asking that you did mention that the capitalist internal contradictions about the share of the market when the capitalists are competing. You talked about that labor for in the surplus value, the way it is created, and the way it is, the profits are ensured for the capitalists through the, appropriating the surplus value. So, what about the crisis among the capitalists when they compete for the same market?
Something I couldn't get the. What about the crisis? Pardon again.
Crisis where the capitalists are actually competing with one another for sharing of the market.
Oh, where uh,
Competition among the
crisis?
capitalists? Yes,
Yes, competing crisis emanating from competition among the capitalists. Now,
we also,
I did not talk about that. You are perfectly right in your argument that capitalist competition can also, this will also lead to money. We are talking about overproduction, the reasons for
right.
overproduction. This would be one of the reasons for overproduction when enterprises are competing with one another producing the same good. This could lead to overproduction because what would happen is that in order to keep my market in the face of competition, I will increase my inventory in the anticipation that if there's an expansion of demand, I'll be able to meet that demand and competitors will not come in. And then there's a more prominent, more critical point about competition among capitals when you come to national capitals and the competition among which leads to imperialism. That is also very, when monopoly capital is born, competition among the monopoly capitals for capture of the market. This leads to gives a different dimension to crisis, which leads to which imperialism, etc., which we will discuss in a later phase
Okay, okay,
because
okay, okay,
imperialism is not actually discussed in so detail by Marx, but later on by Lenin, Luxemburg, etc. We'll discuss this point.
okay, okay, okay. Thank you.
So I think I'll move on to the discussion of the state. Okay. Just a second. So can you see the slide? People, is the slide visible? Okay. So we start our discussion on the state by first discussing the significance. Why are we concerned with the state in the in discussing Marxism? We will see in a subsequent lecture that Marx focused on our concern with the state is because of the nature of Marx's concern, which is on his basic concern is with human emancipation. Ultimate concern is human emancipation. We'll see this. But he focused on two kinds of emancipations, partial emancipations. One is freedom, political emancipation, though he was concerned ultimately with total emancipation, that is, emancipation of humanity from all kinds of repressions and oppressions. His first partial emancipation with which is concerned is freeing individuals from discrimination by the state on the basis of identity. Specifically, he was talking of discrimination on the basis of religion, on the Jewish question, which has now come back in a large way. This has become a worldwide phenomenon. In our country, we have discrimination against the non-Hindus. In Islamic states, you have the discrimination against non-Islamics, and the growing trend of conservative Christianity with the rise of elements like Bolsonaro and Trump. So this is something which was then the political emancipation Marx was talking about is now becoming again a necessity. Freeing individuals from discrimination by the state on the basis of identity, specifically religion, and property. In what sense was property impinging on political emancipation? Because it limited franchise. Now, these freedoms are enshrined constitutionally in the secular state based on unrestricted franchise to all citizens, which adult franchise. This is the ideal modern bourgeois state, though capital can as well thrive under less emancipated states. Which this is very clear in our country, for example. You'll find all the big capitalists, including Tata, who's a Parsi, going to Nagpur, the headquarters of RSS. So capital can as well thrive under less emancipated states. Although, in fact, if we have time at the end of the lectures, we can go into our specific case. In fact, less emancipated states are those states which have the ability to enforce unequal laws, and like the say the labor codes. In spite of that, they will their popularity can remain. This is a separate question. So bourgeois capitalists can function under less emancipated states, but this is a kind of emancipation that Marx was very concerned about, political emancipation, freeing individuals from discrimination by the state on the basis of identity and property. And the other kind of emancipation on which he focused was emancipation from private ownership of productive property. Without this, the deformities of the state will continue to exist in civil society. That is what he said, that political emancipation was all right, but political emancipation would not lead would not be, unlike what classical political economists argued, that political emancipation you had of everyone was citizen with equal rights, so you had equality and freedom and Bentham, and so there was no further emancipation that was necessary. Marx went to the depth and showed that actually there was slavery within the factory. So what was there in the political society was now passed on to the civil society. So for that emancipation, he claimed that productive property, private ownership of productive property had to be abolished. There had to be emancipation. Now, uh, in places it suggests this as the key to human emancipation. We'll talk about that, we'll critique that position. Now both these emancipations, political emancipation and emancipation from private ownership of productive property, both these emancipations involve the state as an important agency. If you feel political emancipation is the state, abrogation of private property rights simply improves the state. And this, according to Marx, starts a process which ends with the regency of the state, the renewal of the state. We'll talk about that. Hence, the importance of the state in Marxian theory. There are basically two kinds of views about the state divided in Marx. One is what is called the instrumentalist view, and the other is called which grants an amount of autonomy to the state. Marx generally used an instrumentalist view of the state. Now, I think that it's a problem with the net.
The previous slide we could hear properly. Yeah, I can make out.
Hmm?
I understand that.
Yeah, uh, I think I've gone out. No, can you see? Can you hear me? Now it's clear. Okay. Yes. Acha, can you see the slide? This slide. No, that is the previous slide. This is the first
Okay,
slide.
okay, this. Okay,
Okay. So I was saying we were discussing why state is important to Marxian theory. Now, Marx's focus was on human emancipation, freedom of humanity from all exploitations and repressions. Please tell me the moment that I go off. Can you hear me? Acha. So, but though this was his fundamental concern, his ultimate concern, he also talked of partial emancipations, and there were two particular partial emancipations with which he dealt with in detail. First, political emancipation, that is, freeing individuals from discrimination by the state on the basis of identity. Specifically, he was talking of discrimination on the basis of religion, Judaism, and also freeing them from rights, and those there were people who were deprived of rights, and those who were landed gentry, they had the more rights, etc., etc. So these freedoms are enshrined constitutionally in a secular state based on unrestricted franchise to all citizens, that is adult franchise secular state. This is the ideal modern bourgeois state, though capital can as well thrive under less emancipated states, as we see today that in India, in fact, it is much better for crony capital if you do not have the modern bourgeois state. Those who are enjoy the patronage of the less emancipated states can gain more, like presently the Ambanis, the Adanis, etc., etc. So that's a different question. So this was one emancipation, which was partial emancipation with which Marx was concerned. And the second kind of partial emancipation with which Marx was concerned was the emancipation from private ownership of productive property. Marx said that political emancipation, this was treated by classical political economy as if this was the final emancipation. That is, equality and Bentham ruled. As the classical political economists said, that you have equal citizens' rights, all are equal citizens, the state treats everyone equally, and so there is no further emancipation that is necessary. But Marx pointed out, he went to the depth, he pierced the surface of the market, went to the depth of the production process, and there uncovered for us the slave master relation within the factory. So Marx then said that you have to emancipate from private ownership of productive property in order to end this enslavement. So though classical political economy claimed that political emancipation, the birth of the secular bourgeois state based on adult franchise, would be the ultimate emancipation because all are equal. Marx said that no, what this does is to push the political deformities to civil society, where without the state discriminating, the economy discriminates, and you have the master slave relation. So these are the two partial emancipations with which he was concerned. Both these emancipations involve the state as an important agency. Of course, in the case of political emancipation, its field is the state, so state is important. In the case of abrogation of property, private property right, this has to be implemented through the state, and this, according to Marx, starts a process which ends with the withering away or redundancy of the state. Hence, state is important to Marx's theory, Marxian theory. Now, I I'll complete this slide, and I think we won't have time for any other discussion that is being interrupted too much by my internet problems. So there are two theories of the state which we find in Marx. One is an instrumentalist view of the state, that the state functions as an instrument of the ruling class, and the other is which talks to the relative autonomy of the state. Marx generally used an instrumentalist view of the state. In the Communist Manifesto, he says political power, properly so called, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. So, political power, which is enshrined in the state, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. So, this is clearly the state is used as a means of oppression. Engels elucidates the concept of power. This I'm quoting from Lenin's State and Revolution. Engels elucidates the concept of power, which Marx had talked about, which is called the state, a power which arose from society but places itself above it and alienates itself more and more from it. What does this power mainly consist of? It consists of special bodies of armed men having prisons, etc., at their command. So here, this power, which is called the state, it arose from the society. Why? Because society needed to organize itself, its production. It needed to organize, say, rules for family, etc., etc. So you need an organization for distribution of commodities. So all these together, so these organs, they started growing. There was the family, there were rules for property, and from this ultimately they emerged the state, where all these ideas were combined together. And then the state, which arose from the need of the people, slowly alienated itself, slowly distanced itself from the people, and then it started oppressing the people. And it made itself on what was it grounded? Armed men having prisons, etc. So this became the instruments of power of coercion. So again, Engels is elucidating what is there, what Marx and Engels both talk about in the Communist Manifesto. But the mere fact that it is a class and no longer, now why is the state so necessary for particularly the bourgeoisie? By the mere fact that it is a class and no longer an estate, the bourgeoisie is forced to organize itself no longer locally but nationally and to give a general form to its average interests. Previously, the state was not centralized. The feudal state, for example, it was a disintegrated state. You had a king, all right, but the localities, the power was really vested in the local authorities, the local nobility. But the bourgeoisie is forced to organize itself no longer locally but nationally to give it a general form to its average interest because it is a class and no longer an estate. But what does it mean by class and no longer an estate? This is a quote from the German ideology. Estates were clergy, nobility, common people. These were traditionally considered three estates in feudal society. And they were recognized by the feudal rulers, and so they were given some kind of representation by the feudal ruler. But the capitalist class was no longer demanding a recognition just like any other estate. As a class, capitalists have outgrown the recognition by feudal order and society. It stands against that order. It does not recognize any order apart from its own. It needs state to impose its own rules, private property, exchange unhindered by social interests, etc. So the capitalists no longer demand that we be recognized, just like the peasant is recognized, just like the priest is recognized, we be recognized, or just like the press is recognized. They want to impose their own rules on the whole of society, private property, exchange unhindered by social interests, etc. So I think I will end here and take questions if there are any. I'm sorry that I couldn't proceed as much as I wanted because the fact that my internet connection was very bad. Yes,
Um, do we have any question for Pranabda?
Yes, I do have.
yes,
Yeah, yeah, sure, sure,
Uh,
sure.
I was just thinking about Pramda that when you talked about that Engels' concept of power, that appeared Engels' concept of power that you quoted from Communist Manifesto. Engels'
yes, yeah,
concept of power. So it's not
yeah,
unique.
concept of power. Yes, yes,
Or can you hear me
yes,
now?
yeah. I
Okay,
can hear
okay.
you.
Yeah, wait for
Yes, yes, yes.
yes.
Shall
So
I bring that slide?
no, I don't need. I don't need.
Okay, okay.
What I'm saying that the power appeared quite brute and there is no sense of authority actually. So
Mm.
I was just thinking that Marx was also talking about the ideological control of the people.
Ideological. I will talk about. I forgot to mention the scope that we. I'll talk about the instrumentalist view. I'll talk about the autonomous state view, and I will
Right.
also talk about the ideological state apparatus.
Okay, okay. This will come later. Okay,
Yeah, yeah. I will
okay,
discuss it. Yes,
okay,
okay.
okay.
Thank you.
So the power becomes when whoever talked about that authority and power differentiation,
Yeah.
and here
Now
power is coming
it
very
becomes
crude form.
built into the person. Yes,
Yes.
yes, yes. Thank you.
So that is the one, and other one is that when capitalism is actually declaring its authority of its own without caring for what other people recognize or not. I think that capitalism is also trying to appropriate other forms of power within its own fold. For example, patriarchy. Patriarchy is a product which was there before the capitalism, but capitalism, nicely, smartly absorbed patriarchal values and culture within its own fold in their own terms. So it is not just denying other forms of power, but appropriation of power of the capital, other forms of power within the capitalist mode. I was thinking in that line actually, so I may be wrong.
Actually, Mm, I would differ. Patriarchy, you see, as long as there is no conflict between us, patriarchy is something which is an element of component of oppression as opposed to exploitation. Hmm. Exploitation is where surplus is produced and appropriated. Oppression could be of various kinds, denial of various kinds of freedoms which do not involve production or appropriation of surplus, like say the girl child is denied education compared to the male child, where the patriarchy, where the woman is oppressed. Uh, you have religious oppression. Uh, yeah, all these are oppressions now, which may not amount, which may or may not uh, help in exploitation. You see, so it is not that patriarchy is directly used by the capitalists, but of course, the family is also a site of production, particularly of labor power. Uh, like there's a lot of literature on this, the value of female labor, how it is undervalued, and this does help in the exploitation of labor within the factory. Hmm. So, in a roundabout sense, actually, capital intrudes into the family, and within the family itself is an exploitative system where the woman's labor is denigrated, devalued, etc., etc. But generally, when we talk of patriarchy, we are talking of oppression, which is different from exploitation, which is a form of which is capitalist exploitation. This would be
I
my submission.
I understand your argument, Puranda. My problem is that if you look at the Marxist feminist argument, they will be talking about that women's free labor in the domestic front is indirectly or directly contributing to the capitalist profitability. So it is exploitation also, because unless women are actually doing it free, the labor, the wages cannot be that low. If worker will have to pay for their domestic front and all these things, then it will be different. So the ideality of women's free labor in the domestic front is actually contributing to the capitalist profitability in a
Yes,
different
yes,
great way.
yes.
So that will be leading to
I quite
exploitation.
agree.
We will
I
discuss that
quite
because your
agree.
internet is really a bad issue because again your voice is getting cut off. Next day we'll take on.
Yes, no, I don't know. There is a problem with my internet.
Yes.
Again, I
Okay.
can I be
Someone.
heard now? I don't think I.
No, I heard it, but we are audible now.
Yes.
But thing is that in between it is getting
I'm
disconnected.
sorry, I can't do
No,
anything
it's
about
fine.
it.
It's fine. It's fine. It's not in your under
Rajesh,
control. Uh,
Yeah, no, I don't have a question. So it's just a follow-up thought on regarding this subsidization or of wage
patriarchy.
uh, through domestic labor, family labor, women's unpaid labor. Now, patriarchy is a different order, and I think class exploitation is a different phenomena, and they might reinforce each other in in certain contexts. But I was wondering if on one hand, it is true that by women's unpaid labor and others unpaid labor, wages may be subsidized, but in the same uh, in the same as a result of the same process, the capitalist also loses markets for subsistence goods. So if that was not, so the market also remains limited. For example, if it was not produced within the family, it would have to be bought in the market. To the extent that so patriarchy provides one benefit, but also has a negative impact in the sense of limiting the market. If we just focus on the subsidization of a wage part, because primitive accumulation led to the creation of this market for wage goods, right? The means of subsistence were taken away. So, and the generalized market economy emerged because of that. Earlier, people had access to means of production, and therefore they could produce their own, subsistence. But now they cannot. They have to work on the same machines in a factory, get the wages, and buy the same things, but now in the market, which is a capitalist commodity. This process does get constrained to the extent that patriarchy enables provision of goods and services within the family for which no payment has to be made. So I think patriarchy has both a positive and a negative impact on capitalism, on capitalist, say, the class processes.
Yeah, I think so, but it would actually the more general question which Mr. Nandan may be hinting at, I'm not sure, but one can expand this idea that the interaction between the non-capitalist sector and the capitalist sector, particularly, which is
Absolutely.
particularly important in countries like India, is not
Absolutely.
just the female labor, household labor, but also the huge segments of what we call,
Farmers, farmers, petty producers.
which is definitely a question
I,
which
thi- I think the question is that does it exist, patriarchy, non-capitalist forms, uh, because capital needs it, or is it that because it exists, capitalist uses it? So I think that is something that always bothers me as a question. How to look at this? I think we have lost Pranab again. Okay. No, he's having problems. Maybe we can have the conversation next day.
yeah, sorry, yes. I heard that bit where Rajesh was saying that does capitalism use create patriarchy, or patriarchy exists and so you use it? Yeah, I suppose if we were to expand it to the non-capitalist sector, not just the household sector, we could say that the non-capitalist sector is not created. It's not that the capitalists by policy create the non-capitalist sector. The non-capitalist sector exists. Maybe the state requires it to some extent. The capitalist sector doesn't require it. But then the capitalist sector also takes advantage of the non-capitalist sector. In that sense, patriarchy exists, and maybe it works both ways, as Rajesh was saying. In one way, it would cheapen labor power, true, but in another way, it would take away a part of the capitalist market. So, yes. Are there any other things? Otherwise, I'll close for the day because I don't know when I'll go off. Get the slides 7 and 8.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Good night. Sorry for all the disturbance in the net.
Thank you for the uh, Friday. Okay.